The land had always been quiet. It stretched endlessly in every direction, a vast, uninterrupted expanse of rolling terrain that seemed untouched by time. 2,300 acres of inherited property, passed down through generations, carried not just monetary value but history, identity, and a sense of permanence. It was the kind of land that didn't need fences to define it, because its boundaries were already etched into records, memory, and legacy. For years, the property remained mostly dormant. Occasional visits, routine inspections, and long-term plans filled the gaps between active use. It wasn't abandoned, but it wasn't watched closely either. There was a certain trust in its isolation, a belief that something so large and so documented couldn't simply be disturbed without consequence. That belief didn't last. The first sign of something wrong was subtle, almost easy to dismiss. A newly paved road appeared along the southern edge of the land, cutting cleanly through what had always been untouched terrain. It wasn't marked on any survey, nor was it approved through any known agreement. At first glance, it seemed like an error, perhaps a neighboring property expanding slightly too far. But then came the second sign. Utility markers began appearing. Bright flags, temporary stakes, and small posts driven into the soil with a level of confidence that suggested permanence. They weren't random. They followed a pattern, a deliberate layout that hinted at something larger taking shape. Curiosity turned into concern. A deeper inspection revealed more than just markers. There were signs of planning, survey lines, grading adjustments, and even early construction materials staged in specific areas. It became clear that this wasn't accidental encroachment. It was organized, intentional. And then came the moment everything changed. At the center of the activity, partially hidden behind a cluster of temporary fencing, stood a sign. Clean, polished, and professionally printed. It displayed a name that had never been associated with the land before, a homeowners association. An HOA that, according to that sign, governed a residential development already in progress. The realization didn't hit all at once. It unfolded slowly, piece by piece, as the implications became impossible to ignore. An entire association was being built on land that didn't belong to them. There had been no sale, no transfer, no lease, no agreement of any kind. Yet somehow, structures were rising, plans were being executed, and an organization was operating as if ownership had already been established. The silence of the land had been replaced by something else entirely. And whatever was happening, it wasn't going to stay hidden for long. The deeper investigation revealed something far more complex than simple trespassing. Records began to surface, documents filed quietly, approvals granted under questionable circumstances, and development plans that had been moving forward for months, possibly longer. It became evident that this wasn't a sudden decision by a rogue group. It was a carefully orchestrated process, built on layers of assumptions, misdirection, and strategic omissions. At the heart of it all was a chain of transactions that didn't quite align. A smaller parcel of land adjacent to the property had changed hands multiple times over the past few years. Each transfer added a layer of complexity, eventually creating a confusing boundary overlap that blurred the lines between legitimate ownership and perceived control. Somewhere along that chain, the HOA had inserted itself, expanding its claimed territory far beyond what was legally defined. It was a quiet expansion, executed in stages. First came minor adjustments, small shifts in survey interpretations that went largely unnoticed. Then came infrastructure, justified under the assumption of future development rights. By the time construction began, the narrative had already been established. The land was theirs to develop. The reality, however, told a different story. The official records, when examined closely, still pointed back to the original ownership. The 2,300 acres had never been subdivided in a way that would allow such a development. No authorization had been granted. No legal transfer had occurred. Yet the HOA operated as if none of that mattered. This created a unique challenge. It wasn't just about proving ownership. It was about unraveling a system that had been built to appear legitimate, even when it wasn't. Legal complexities began to surface. Permits had been issued, but under what authority remained unclear. Survey documents existed, but their accuracy was questionable. Contractors had been hired, investors had been involved, and future homeowners were already being promised properties that technically didn't exist within the HOA's rights. It wasn't just a land dispute anymore. It was a situation that involved multiple layers of responsibility, each one connected to the next. The longer it continued, the more difficult it would become to untangle. And time was not on the side of truth. Construction was accelerating. Foundations were being laid. Roads were expanding deeper into the property. What had once been an isolated piece of land was now becoming a fully realized development, built on a claim that had no legal standing. The scale of the issue became undeniable. This wasn't a mistake. It was a calculated move. The weight of the situation began to settle in ways that went beyond legal concerns. The land wasn't just property. It represented years of history, of effort, of decisions made by previous generations who had preserved it with intention. Every acre held a story, a connection to something larger than its physical boundaries. Seeing it transformed without permission created a sense of loss that couldn't be measured in numbers. There was frustration, but also disbelief. The idea that something so significant could be overtaken through a series of administrative maneuvers felt almost unreal. It challenged the assumption that ownership, once established, was secure. But more than anything, there was a growing sense of urgency. Every day that passed allowed the development to deepen its roots. The longer it remained unchallenged, the more difficult it would be to reverse. Structures would become homes. Plans would become realities. And the narrative of ownership would continue to shift in favor of those who acted first, rather than those who held rightful claim. The emotional impact extended beyond the land itself. There was a broader implication, a question of how easily systems could be manipulated when oversight was minimal and assumptions went unchecked. It wasn't just about one property. It was about the precedent it set. If something like this could happen here, it could happen elsewhere. That realization added another layer to the situation. It wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It became something larger, something that required not just resolution but exposure. The decision to act wasn't driven by anger alone. It was driven by the understanding that allowing it to continue would validate the very system that enabled it. And that was not an option. The shift from private investigation to public confrontation marked a turning point. Evidence was compiled meticulously. Every document, every discrepancy, every unauthorized action was gathered and organized into a clear, undeniable narrative. The goal was not just to prove ownership, but to reveal the entire structure of the HOA's operation. Once the information was ready, it didn't stay hidden. It was presented through official channels, shared with relevant authorities, and brought into the public eye. What had once been a quiet development suddenly became a subject of scrutiny. Attention began to build. Local officials were forced to review permits that had previously gone unquestioned. Contractors faced inquiries about the legitimacy of their work. Potential buyers started asking questions that hadn't been considered before. The HOA, which had operated with confidence, now found itself under pressure. Their response was swift but revealing. Attempts were made to justify their position, to present their actions as based on legitimate interpretations of existing agreements. But the more they explained, the more inconsistencies appeared. The narrative began to shift. What once looked like a standard development now appeared as something far more questionable. Public perception changed, and with it came increased scrutiny from multiple directions. The tension escalated. This was no longer a hidden issue. It had become a challenge that demanded resolution. As the investigation deepened, a discovery emerged that changed everything. Hidden within the chain of transactions was a critical error, one that invalidated the HOA's entire claim. A key document, relied upon as the foundation of their authority, contained a flaw that had gone unnoticed. It wasn't just a minor mistake. It was a fundamental issue that rendered the entire development legally unsustainable. The implications were immediate. Without that document, the HOA had no legitimate basis for its expansion. Every action taken under its authority became questionable. Every structure built, every permit issued, every promise made, all of it stood on unstable ground. The revelation shifted the balance completely. What had once seemed like a complex legal battle now had a clear focal point. The argument was no longer about interpretation. It was about validity. And the HOA's position could not withstand it. The final phase did not arrive with a single decisive moment. It unfolded in layers, each one peeling back the illusion that had allowed the situation to grow unchecked. What had once seemed like an unstoppable development began to slow, then stall, and eventually reverse under the weight of undeniable facts. The first visible shift came when construction activity stopped. The machinery that had once moved relentlessly across the land fell silent. Excavators stood frozen mid-task, their metal arms suspended like monuments to a project that had lost its momentum. Materials remained stacked in organized rows, untouched, as if waiting for instructions that would never come. The energy that had fueled rapid expansion was gone, replaced by uncertainty. This pause was not voluntary. It was the result of legal intervention that had finally caught up with the operation. Orders were issued, backed by documentation that left little room for interpretation. The discovery of the critical flaw in the HOA's foundational claim had done more than weaken their position, it had dismantled it entirely. Without a valid basis for their authority, every action they had taken became subject to scrutiny. The process that followed was methodical. Reviews were conducted at multiple levels. Permits that had been granted were re-examined, revealing gaps in verification and oversight. Survey reports were challenged, exposing inconsistencies that had previously gone unnoticed or unaddressed. The chain of transactions that had created the illusion of legitimacy was traced back step by step, each link revealing how assumptions had replaced confirmation. What emerged was not a single point of failure, but a system that had allowed convenience to override accuracy. For those involved in the development, the implications were immediate and far-reaching. Contractors faced the reality that their work had been authorized under questionable circumstances. Investors began to recognize the instability of the project they had supported. Potential homeowners, who had once envisioned future residences on the land, found themselves caught in a situation that no longer promised certainty. The narrative that had sustained the HOA began to collapse. Efforts to defend their position grew less confident, less cohesive. What had once been presented as a clear and justified expansion now appeared fragmented, dependent on interpretations that could not withstand closer examination. The authority they had exercised so freely was revealed to be built on a foundation that did not exist in any legally meaningful way. As the legal process advanced, the focus shifted from halting the development to addressing its consequences. Structures that had already been built could not simply be ignored. Roads that had been laid into the land represented physical changes that required careful consideration. The question was no longer just about stopping further action, it was about determining how to restore what had been altered. This stage required precision. Each element of the development was evaluated individually. Some components were deemed reversible, their removal necessary to return the land to its original state. Others required negotiation, balancing practical limitations with the need to correct unauthorized use. The process was not quick, nor was it simple, but it was guided by a clear principle: the land would not remain under the control of an entity that had no rightful claim to it. Ownership, once questioned, was reaffirmed with clarity. Official records were updated to reflect the findings, eliminating any ambiguity that had allowed the situation to arise. Boundaries were re-established with precision, supported by verified surveys and documented agreements. What had been assumed by others was now confirmed through processes that left no room for misinterpretation. The land, though changed in appearance, remained intact in its legal identity. But the resolution extended beyond the property itself. The situation triggered a broader response within the systems that had enabled it. Local authorities began reviewing their procedures, identifying weaknesses that had allowed permits to be issued without sufficient verification. Regulatory bodies reassessed their standards, implementing measures designed to prevent similar occurrences in the future. It became clear that the issue had not been isolated. It was a reflection of gaps that existed within larger frameworks, gaps that could be exploited when oversight was limited or assumptions went unchallenged. The case served as a catalyst for change, prompting adjustments that would extend beyond a single piece of land. For those who had observed the situation from the outside, the outcome carried its own significance. The public attention that had once focused on the conflict now shifted toward the resolution. What had started as a quiet encroachment had become a visible example of how quickly circumstances could escalate when accountability was absent. The reversal of the development demonstrated that such situations, while complex, were not beyond correction. But it also highlighted the cost of inaction. The land had not remained untouched. Time, resources, and effort had been invested in a project that ultimately could not stand. The impact was not limited to those directly responsible, it extended to everyone who had become involved under the assumption that the foundation was secure. This reality underscored a critical lesson. Ownership, while documented, is not self-enforcing. It requires awareness, attention, and a willingness to act when boundaries are tested. The existence of records does not guarantee their protection if they are not actively upheld. The experience reshaped perspectives. What had once been seen as a distant, stable asset was now understood as something that required engagement. The idea that scale alone could provide security had been challenged, replaced by the recognition that even the largest holdings could be affected by calculated actions. The land itself began to return to a state of quiet. Without the noise of construction, its natural rhythm re-emerged. The presence of machinery diminished as equipment was removed or repurposed. The signs that had once marked unauthorized development were taken down, leaving behind only the subtle traces of what had occurred. Those traces, however, were not erased. They remained as a reminder of the events that had unfolded, a visible indication that the land had been tested and had endured. The changes, though addressed, became part of its story, a chapter that could not be undone but could be understood. In the end, the resolution was not defined by victory in a traditional sense. It was defined by restoration. The restoration of ownership, of clarity, and of boundaries that had been challenged. It was also defined by the lessons that emerged from the experience, lessons that extended beyond a single situation and into a broader understanding of how systems function, and how they can fail. The HOA, once positioned as an authority, became an example instead. An example of what can happen when assumptions replace verification, when expansion is pursued without a solid foundation, and when oversight is treated as a formality rather than a necessity. The land remained. Its value unchanged in essence, though its history now richer with the knowledge of what it had faced. It stood as it always had, vast, quiet, and enduring, but no longer taken for granted. And that was the lasting impact. Not just that the situation had been resolved, but that it had revealed something deeper about the nature of ownership, responsibility, and vigilance. It showed that even in systems designed to provide order, there is always a need for awareness. Because what had happened once could happen again. And the difference between loss and preservation often lies in the moment when something is first noticed, and the decision that follows.